双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Eugenie Grandet by Honoré de Balzac, translated by Catherine Prescott Wormley. Dedication to Maria. May your name, that of one whose portrait is the noblest ornament of this work, lie on its opening pages like a branch of sacred box, taken from an unknown tree, but sanctified by religion, and kept ever fresh and green by pious hands to bless the house. De Balzac. Eugenie Grandet. There are houses in certain provincial towns whose aspect inspires melancholy, akin to that called forth by somber cloisters, dreary moorlands, or the desolation of ruins. Within these houses there is, perhaps, the silence of the cloister, the barrenness of moors, the skeleton of ruins. Life and movement are so stagnant there that a stranger might think them uninhabited, were it not that he encounters suddenly the pale, cold glance of a motionless person, whose monastic face peers beyond the window casing at the sound of an unaccustomed step. Such elements of sadness formed the physiognomy, as it were, of a dwelling-house in Saumur which stands at the end of the steep street leading to the chateau in the upper part of the town. This street, now little frequented, hot in summer, cold in winter, dark in certain sections, is remarkable for the resonance of its little pebbly pavement, always clean and dry, for the narrowness of its tortuous roadway, for the peaceful stillness of its houses, which belong to the old town and are overtopped by the ramparts. Houses 3 centuries old are still solid, though built of wood, and their diverse aspects add to the originality which commends this portion of Saumur to the attention of artists and antiquaries. It is difficult to pass these houses without admiring the enormous oaken beams, their ends carved into fantastic figures, which crown with a black bas-relief the lower floor of most of them. In one place these transverse timbers are covered with slate and mark a bluish line along the frail wall of a dwelling covered by a roof/and colombiage/which bends beneath the weight of years, and whose rotting shingles are twisted by the alternate action of sun and rain. In another place blackened, worn-out window-sills, with delicate sculptures, now scarcely discernible, seem too weak to bear the brown clay pots from which springs the heartsease or the rosebush of some poor working woman. Farther on are doors studded with enormous nails, where the genius of our forefathers has traced domestic hieroglyphics, of which the meaning is now lost forever. Here a Protestant attested his belief, there a leaguer cursed Henry IV. Elsewhere some bourgeois has carved the insignia of his /noblesse de cloche/ symbols of his long, forgotten magisterial glory. The whole history of France is there. Next to a tottering house with roughly plastered walls, where an artisan enshrines his tools, rises the mansion of a country gentleman, on the stone arch of which above the door vestiges of armorial bearings may still be seen, battered by the many revolutions that have shaken France since 1789. In this hilly street the ground floors of the merchants are neither shops nor warehouses. Lovers of the Middle Ages will here find the oeuvre of our forefathers in all its naive simplicity. These low rooms, which have no shop frontage, no show windows, in fact no glass at all, are deep and dark and without interior or exterior decoration. Their doors open in 2 parts, each roughly iron-bound. The upper half is fastened back within the room. The lower half, fitted with a spring bell, swings continually to and fro. Air and light reach the damp den within, either through the upper half of the door, or through an open space between the ceiling and a low front wall, breast-high, which is closed by solid shutters that are taken down every morning, put up every evening, and held in place by heavy iron bars. This wall serves as a counter for the merchandise. No delusive display is there, only samples of the business, whatever it may chance to be. Such, for instance, as 3 or 4 tubs full of codfish and salt, a few bundles of sailcloth, cordage, copper wire hanging from the joists above, iron hoops for casks ranged along the wall, or a few pieces of cloth upon the shelves. Enter a neat girl, glowing with youth, wearing a white kerchief, her arms red and bare, drops her knitting and calls her father or her mother, one of whom comes forward and sells you what you want, phlegmatically, civilly, or arrogantly, according to his or her individual character, whether it be a matter of 2 sous or 20,000 francs worth of merchandise. You may see a cooper, for instance, sitting in his doorway and twirling his thumbs as he talks with a neighbor. To all appearance, he owns nothing more than a few miserable boat ribs and 2 or 3 bundles of laths. But below in the port his teeming woodyard supplies all the cooperage trade of Anjou. He knows to a plank how many casks are needed if the vintage is good. A hot season makes him rich. A rainy season ruins him. In a single morning puncheons worth 11 francs have been known to drop to 6. In this country, as in Touraine, atmospheric vicissitudes control commercial life. Wine growers, proprietors, wood merchants, coopers, innkeepers, mariners, all keep watch of the sun. They tremble when they go to bed lest they should hear in the morning of a frost in the night. They dread rain, wind, drought, and want water, heat, and clouds to suit their fancy. A perpetual duel goes on between the heavens and their terrestrial interests. The barometer smooths, saddens, or makes merry their countenances, turn and turn about, from end to end of the street, formerly the Grande Rue de Saumur. The words, "Here's golden weather," are passed from door to door, or each man calls to his neighbor. It rains Louis, knowing well what a sunbeam or the opportune rainfall is bringing him. On Saturdays after midday, in the fine season, not 1 sou's worth of merchandise can be bought from these worthy traders. Each has his vineyard, his enclosure of fields, and all spend 2 days in the country, this being foreseen, and purchases, sales, and profits provided for. The merchants have 10 or 12 hours to spend in parties of pleasure, in making observations, in criticisms, and in continual spying. A housewife cannot buy a partridge without the neighbors asking the husband if it were cooked to a turn. A young girl never puts her head near a window that she is not seen by idling groups in the street. Consciences are held in the light, and the houses, dark, silent, impenetrable as they seem, hide no mysteries. Life is almost wholly in the open air. Every household sits at its own threshold, breakfasts, dines, and quarrels there. No one can pass along the street without being examined. In fact, formerly, when a stranger entered a provincial town, he was bantered and made game of from door to door. From this came many good stories, and the nickname Chopieu, which was applied to the inhabitants of Angers, who excelled in such urban sarcasms. The ancient mansions of the old town of Saumur are at the top of this hilly street, and were formerly occupied by the nobility of the neighborhood. The melancholy dwelling where the events of the following history took place is one of these mansions, venerable relics of a century in which men and things bore the characteristics of simplicity which French manners and customs are losing day by day. Follow the windings of the picturesque thoroughfare, whose irregularities awaken recollections that plunge the mind mechanically into reverie, and you will see a somewhat dark recess, in the center of which is hidden the door of the house of Monsieur Grandet. It is impossible to understand the force of this provincial expression, the house of Monsieur Grandet, without giving the biography of Monsieur Grandet himself. Monsieur Grandet enjoyed a reputation in Saumur whose causes and effects can never be fully understood by those who have not, at one time or another, lived in the provinces. In 1789, Monsieur Grandet, still called by certain persons Le Père Grandet, though the number of such old persons has perceptibly diminished, was a master cooper, able to read, write, and cipher. At the period when the French Republic offered for sale the church property in the arrondissement of Saumur, the cooper, then 40 years of age, had just married the daughter of a rich wood merchant, supplied with the ready money of his own fortune and his wife's dote. In all about 2,000 louis d'or. Grandet went to the newly established district, where, with the help of 200 double Louis given by his father-in-law to the surly Republican who presided over the sales of the national domain. He obtained for a song, legally if not legitimately, one of the finest vineyards in the arrondissement, an old abbey, and several farms. The inhabitants of Saumur were so little revolutionary that they thought Père Grandet a bold man, a Republican, and a patriot with a mind open to all the new ideas, though in point of fact it was open only to vineyards. He was appointed a member of the administration of Saumur, and his pacific influence made itself felt politically and commercially. Politically, he protected the ci-devant nobles, and prevented, to the extent of his power, the sale of the lands and property of the /émigrés. Commercially, he furnished the Republican armies with 2,000 or 3,000 puncheons of white wine, and took his pay in splendid fields belonging to a community of women whose lands had been reserved for the last lot. Under the consulate, Grandet became mayor, governed wisely, and harvested still better pickings. Under the Empire, he was called Monsieur Grandet. Napoleon, however, did not like Republicans, and superseded Monsieur Grandet, who was supposed to have worn the Phrygian cap, by a man of his own surroundings, a future baron of the Empire. Monsieur Grandet quitted office without regret. He had constructed in the interests of the town certain fine roads which led to his own property. His house and lands, very advantageously assessed, paid moderate taxes, and since the registration of his various estates, the vineyards, thanks to his constant care, had become the head of the country, a local term used to denote those that produced the finest quality of wine. He might have asked for the Cross of the Legion of Honor. This event occurred in 1806. Monsieur Grandet was then 57 years of age, his wife 36, and an only daughter, the fruit of their legitimate love, was 10 years old. Monsieur Grandet, whom Providence no doubt desired to compensate for the loss of his municipal honors, inherited 3 fortunes in the course of this year: that of Madame de la Gaudinière, born de la Bertellière, the mother of Madame Grandet; that of old Monsieur de la Bertellière, her grandfather; and, lastly, that of Madame Gentillet, her grandmother on the mother's side. 3 inheritances, whose amount was not known to anyone. The avarice of the deceased persons was so keen that for a long time they had hoarded their money for the pleasure of secretly looking at it. Old Monsieur de la Bertellière called an investment an extravagance, and thought he got better interest from the sight of his gold than from the profits of usury. The inhabitants of Saumur consequently estimated his savings according to the revenues of the son's wealth. As they said, Monsieur Grandet thus obtained that modern title of nobility which our mania for equality can never rub out. He became the most imposing personage in the arrondissement. He worked 100 acres of vineyard, which in fruitful years yielded 700 or 800 hogsheads of wine. He owned 13 farms, an old abbey, whose windows and arches he had walled up for the sake of economy, a measure which preserved them, also 127 acres of meadowland, where 3,000 poplars, planted in 1793, grew and flourished, and finally, the house in which he lived. Such was his visible estate. As to his other property, only 2 persons could give even a vague guess at its value. One was Monsieur Cruchot, a notary employed in the usurious investments of Monsieur Grandet. The other was Monsieur de Grassins, the richest banker in Saumur, in whose profits Grandet had a certain covenanted and secret share. Although old Cruchot and Monsieur de Grassins were both gifted with the deep discretion which wealth and trust beget in the provinces, they publicly testified so much respect to Monsieur Grandet that observers estimated the amount of his property by the obsequious attention which they bestowed upon him. In all Saumur there was no one not persuaded that Monsieur Grandet had a private treasure, some hiding place full of louis, where he nightly took ineffable delight in gazing upon great masses of gold. Avaricious people gathered proof of this when they looked at the eyes of the good man, to which the yellow metal seemed to have conveyed its tints. The glance of a man accustomed to draw enormous interest from his capital acquires, like that of the libertine, the gambler, or the sycophant. Certain indefinable habits, furtive, eager, mysterious movements, which never escape the notice of his co-religionists. This secret language is in a certain way the Freemasonry of the passions. Monsieur Grandet inspired the respectful esteem due to one who owed no man anything, who, skillful cooper and experienced wine-grower that he was, guessed with the precision of an astronomer whether he ought to manufacture 1,000 puncheons for his vintage, or only 500, who never failed in any speculation, and always had casks for sale when casks were worth more than the commodity that filled them, who could store his whole vintage in his cellars and bide his time to put the puncheons on the market at 200 francs, when the little proprietors had been forced to sell theirs for 5 louis. His famous vintage of 1811, judiciously stored and slowly disposed of, brought him in more than 240,000 francs. Financially speaking, Monsieur Grandet was something between a tiger and a boa constrictor. He could crouch and lie low, watch his prey a long while, spring upon it, open his jaws, swallow a mass of louis, and then rest tranquilly like a snake in process of digestion. Impassible, methodical, and cold. No one saw him pass without a feeling of admiration mingled with respect and fear. Had not every man in Saumur felt the rending of those polished steel claws? For this one, Maître Cruchot had procured the money required for the purchase of a domain, but at 11%. For that one, Monsieur de Grassin's discounted bills of exchange, but at a frightful deduction of interest. Few days ever passed that Monsieur Grandet's name was not mentioned either in the markets or in social conversations at the evening gatherings. To some the fortune of the old wine-grower was an object of patriotic pride. More than one merchant, more than one innkeeper, said to strangers with a certain complacency,
Monsieur,
we have 2 or 3 millionaire establishments, but as for Monsieur Grandet, he does not himself know how much he is worth. In 1816, the best reckoners in Saumur estimated the landed property of the worthy man at nearly 4 millions. But as, on an average, he had made yearly, from 1793 to 1817, 100,000 francs out of that property, it was fair to presume that he possessed in actual money a sum nearly equal to the value of his estate. So that when, after a game of Boston, or an evening discussion on the matter of vines, the talk fell upon Monsieur Grandet, knowing people said, Le Père Grandet? Le Père Grandet must have at least 5 or 6 millions. You are cleverer than I am. I have never been able to find out the amount, answered Monsieur Cruchot or Monsieur de Grassins, when either chanced to overhear the remark. If some Parisian mentioned Rothschild or Monsieur Lafitte, the people of Saumur asked if he were as rich as Monsieur Grandet. When the Parisian, with a smile, tossed them a disdainful affirmative, they looked at each other and shook their heads with an incredulous air. So large a fortune covered with a golden mantle all the actions of this man. If in early days some peculiarities of his life gave occasion for laughter or ridicule, laughter and ridicule had long since died away. His least important actions had the authority of results repeatedly shown. His speech, his clothing, his gestures, the blinking of his eyes, were law to the countryside, where every one, after studying him as a naturalist studies the result of instinct in the lower animals, had come to understand the deep mute wisdom of his slightest actions. It will be a hard winter, said one. Père Grandet has put on his fur gloves. Père Grandet is buying quantities of staves. There will be plenty of wine this year. Monsieur Grandet never bought either bread or meat. His farmers supplied him weekly with a sufficiency of capons, chickens, eggs, butter, and his tithe of wheat. He owned a mill, and the tenant was bound, over and above his rent, to take a certain quantity of grain and return him the flour and bran. La Grande Nanon, his only servant, though she was no longer young, baked the bread of the household herself every Saturday. Monsieur Grandet arranged with kitchen gardeners who were his tenants to supply him with vegetables. As to fruits, he gathered such quantities that he sold the greater part in the market. His firewood was cut from his own hedgerows or taken from the half-rotten old sheds which he built at the corners of his fields, and whose planks the farmers carted into town for him, all cut up and obligingly stacked in his woodhouse, receiving in return his thanks. His only known expenditures were for the consecrated bread, the clothing of his wife and daughter, the hire of their chairs in church, the wages of la grandnannon, the tinning of the saucepans, lights, taxes, repairs on his buildings, and the costs of his various industries. He had 600 acres of woodland, lately purchased, which he induced a neighbor's keeper to watch, under the promise of an indemnity. After the acquisition of this property, he ate game for the first time. Monsieur Grandet's manners were very simple. He spoke little. He usually expressed his meaning by short sententious phrases uttered in a soft voice. After the Revolution, the epoch at which he first came into notice, the good man stuttered in a wearisome way as soon as he was required to speak at length or to maintain an argument. This stammering, the incoherence of his language, the flux of words in which he drowned his thought, his apparent lack of logic, attributed to defects of education, were in reality assumed, and will be sufficiently explained by certain events in the following history. For sentences, precise as algebraic formulas, sufficed him usually to grasp and solve all difficulties of life and commerce. I don't know. I cannot. I will not. I will see about it. He never said yes or no, and never committed himself to writing. If people talked to him, he listened coldly, holding his chin in his right hand and resting his right elbow in the back of his left hand, forming in his own mind opinions on all matters, from which he never receded. He reflected long before making any business agreement. When his opponent, after careful conversation, avowed the secret of his own purposes, confident that he had secured his listener's assent, Grandet answered, "I can decide nothing without consulting my wife." His wife, whom he had reduced to a state of helpless slavery, was a useful screen to him in business. He went nowhere among friends. He neither gave nor accepted dinners. He made no stir or noise, seeming to economize in everything, even movement. He never disturbed or disarranged the things of other people, out of respect for the rights of property. Nevertheless, in spite of his soft voice, in spite of his circumspect bearing, the language and habits of a coarse nature came to the surface, especially in his own home, where he controlled himself less than elsewhere. Physically, Grandet was a man 5 feet high, thick-set, square-built, with calves 12 inches in circumference, knotted knee joints, and broad shoulders. His face was round, tanned, and pitted by the small pox. His chin was straight. His lips had no curves. His teeth were white. His eyes had that calm, devouring expression which people attribute to the basilisk. His forehead, full of transverse wrinkles, was not without certain significant protuberances. His yellow-grayish hair was said to be silver and gold by certain young people who did not realize the impropriety of making a jest about Monsieur Grandet. His nose, thick at the end, bore a veined one, which the common people said, not without reason, was full of malice. The whole countenance showed a dangerous cunning, an integrity without warmth, the egotism of a man long used to concentrate every feeling upon the enjoyments of avarice and upon the only human being who was anything whatever to him, his daughter and sole heiress.